Jill mentioned, my name is Karen Hagerman. I work with the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, which is an initiative of Green Blue, an environmental nonprofit that's dedicated to the sustainable use of materials in society. And so Jill already gave an introduction, but for this first half, myself and Adam will be talking about how it relates to the SPC, and then we'll hand it over to Rob for more on the sweep side of it. So for the agenda for our half, we're going to go over a little bit of an intro to the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, and then talk a little bit about what EPR is and set some foundation for EPR for packaging. And then I'll kind of give an overview of the current activity within both the state and federal legislation, and then digging a little more into the elements within those proposed bills. And following that, we'll look at how EPR relates to the broader picture of sustainable packaging. So starting off as an intro to the SPC, so the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, like I said, is an initiative of Green Blue, but what it is a membership-based collaborative that brings stakeholders together from throughout the packaging value chain. So our members include industry, government, and academia, as well as all other aspects that are related to either packaging, production, design, manufacturing, and collection, end-of-life processing, anything related to packaging. We have members that work in different aspects of the value chain there. We also serve as a leading voice on sustainable packaging, and we're really passionate about packaging that is good for both people and the environment. We work with our members to try to drive action for improvements within the packaging system and lend a voice on issues related to challenges and opportunities within packaging sustainability. So our foundation is really based around the principles of collaboration, education, and action. And we really facilitate that through different subgroups where we bring members together. We have events where we engage in new information and spreading education about the whole, everything surrounding sustainable packaging, really anything that touches on it. To note, we as the SBC don't engage in advocacy of public policy, and we neither support or oppose any legislation, including extended producer responsibility, which is what we'll be talking about today. We do approach policy from a lens of understanding the impact that it has on packaging and sustainable material use. So we want to provide information to stakeholders throughout the packaging value chain so they can understand and be educated on what the legislation is and what the current state is. So it's really from that educational viewpoint. So as the SBC, we take a holistic approach to packaging sustainability, focusing on the entire life cycle. We see sustainable packaging as that is sourced responsibly, designed to be effective and safe throughout its life cycle, and managed efficiently at the end of the life so that it can return back into the system. We really do envision a circular system for packaging materials as the future. And as I'm sure you're all aware, many of you on this call and many companies really feel and recognize the need for circular packaging materials and systems. And this transition to a circular economy implies that there will be a certain level of responsibility for producers to consider the end of life of their products. So whether or not this is through legislation is uncertain at this point, but with the amount of activity specifically around EPR in various states, especially at the state level, it does seem like a likely occurrence in the near future. Additionally, a lot more companies and organizations are putting out policy positions either in support of EPR or in support of some other recycling system financing. EPR and all of the ways that it can be implemented is pretty complicated, but the more that stakeholders know, the more they can engage in informed conversation, and that has the potential to increase the effectiveness of whatever solution is implemented. So we want to provide stakeholders throughout the packaging value chain with the resources necessary to understand the landscape of EPR and then take part in these discussions from an informed perspective. So with that, I'll set a little bit of foundation about EPR and specifically EPR for packaging. So EPR, or extended producer responsibility, is a policy approach that assigns significant responsibility to the producers for the end of life of their products. And this can include both financial and operational responsibility, and in varying degrees. So both who is paying for it and who is managing it. Producers are basically required to provide funding and or services that assist in managing the covered products after the use phase, so after the consumer is done with it. Most EPR programs that are in place or that we're seeing in legislation that are specifically for packaging, they encourage or require producers to join a producer responsibility organization, or PRO, though many do allow producers to comply individually. The PRO then develops a producer responsibility plan and manages that producer responsibility program. In some states, you'll hear it referred to as a stewardship program or a stewardship plan, and that brings up the topic of product stewardship, which is really that wider umbrella that EPR sits under. So EPR is a specific policy approach. Product stewardship is the larger picture of being responsible for the products that are produced and put into the market. But you will hear sometimes those terms interchanged when it comes to the legislation. The financial structure may vary, but most EPR programs for packaging require producers to pay fees into the PRO, so into that organization based on the amount of material or type of material that they put on the market. And then the PRO takes those funds and distributes it to cover the costs required by the program legislation. So costs typically provide funding for end-of-life management, so collection, sortation, processing, and specific to covered products. So covered products are either defined in legislation, and I'll touch on this a little later, or they're defined in the producer responsibility plan, but they are the specific items or materials that must be managed within the program. In addition to that, many new bills actually extend cost coverage beyond just the operational, the collection, sortation, and processing. They're extending it to include things like education and outreach, infrastructure improvements, and end market development for recycled materials. Organizations and policymakers are increasingly pointing to effective EPR or some sort of recycling system financing as a critical component of a comprehensive approach to addressing the current challenges that we're seeing within the recycling system, and also concern over single-use product pollution. So I'll move into a little bit of the landscape for legislation right now. And so in the US, we're seeing a lot of legislation being introduced specific to either packaging or packaging and paper products. There are in existence in the US, there are, I think, over 100 EPR programs for other products such as paint, carpet, or electronics, but there are no programs for packaging. In other parts of the world, particularly in the EU and Canada, there are well-established programs for EPR for packaging. But in the US, the legislations that are proposed would be, if passed, they would be the first of their kind. And so what you're looking at here is a map, obviously, of the US. The darker green, so most of the states don't have any sort of legislation for EPR for packaging. The light green, so that would be Colorado and New Hampshire, those have indicated that they're going to introduce a bill this year, or we're intending to, but we haven't actually seen that activity yet. And then the other colored states are in varying stages of having legislation introduced. So the blue means that it's been introduced and that it's in committee or awaiting a vote. The orange, such as New York, so that has been amended several times to refine or further specify the language within the bill. And then the red, so for example, in Washington, that's specific to Senate Bill 5022, which was an EPR bill when it was introduced, and then it was actually amended to remove the EPR language. It became instead a post-consumer recycled content mandate, an expanded polystyrene ban, and a optional food service ware regulation. So that was amended to not be EPR, and then it passed, but it passed without any of the EPR, major EPR components in it. That same thing happened in Hawaii. However, with one of Hawaii's bills, however, the session ended while that was still in committee. And so that's what the dark gray is. The same thing happened in Maryland, or Maryland's bill was in committee and then the session adjourned. So some of these are still active, some sessions are still, the legislators are still in session, and so we expect to see some movement in a lot of these states. I will say that there's interesting, when you start breaking it down, you have some states, as you can see, there's 16 bills here, and they're new ones being introduced every month. But at last count, 16 bills specific to packaging. Some of those states, like Oregon, has multiple bills, others like Maryland just had the one bill. And the interesting distinction too is the level of detail. So In Oregon and Washington, you've got 50 pages, 50 plus pages in some cases of legislation, whereas Maryland's proposed bill was 8 pages. And so the level of detail and what's actually specified in the legislation versus what is expected to be established in the plan is quite different depending on where you look. There's also different factors within the elements that I'll touch on in the next couple slides. The other thing too is that if we step back from the state level, we actually do have legislation at the federal level, which you may be familiar with. That's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and that's House Resolution 2238. There's also a companion Senate bill. And the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act the scope is much larger than EPR. It also includes things like a national bottle bill and a single-use product ban for some products. But a large component, about half of the text, is dedicated to establishing a federal or national level extended producer responsibility program. In addition to the activity in the legislators, we also are seeing activity from organizations. So nonprofit organizations as well as trade associations are releasing policy positions in support of either EPR or financing systems. I want to be clear that not all of these positions included here explicitly reference EPR. Some of them propose alternate financing systems that would be recommended in place of EPR. However, they each touch on elements that are similar to EPR for packaging and worth considering to see how their suggested financing mechanisms differ from the other proposals and bills. And so some of them, like I said, do reference EPR. The Flexible Packaging Association and Product Stewardship Institute put together basically an agreement of elements that they would be able to support in effective EPR policy. The Consumer Good Forum also put out a position on their view of optimal extended producer responsibility. Other ones here, like the one in the center, that's the Recycling Partnerships Accelerating Recycling Plan. And that is not EPR, but it proposes an alternate system that has landfill surcharges and product packaging fees. And those two funding sources together would go towards different aspects of the recycling system and infrastructure and education. Moving on from there, I'll kind of touch on some key elements of EPR. There are way more than this, but I want to highlight a few. So one of the things that I mentioned before was covered products, and there's actually a lot of difference in the bills that we're seeing in the covered products that they actually manage within the program. So covered products are, again, the specific type of material or product type that is included in the program. And this is both the format and the material type. So a lot of them will cover all packaging types, and they'll define what that means within the legislation. Others will extend it to paper products, so non-packaging paper products like printed paper, newspaper, home and office paper as well. And then other bills will either include beverage containers or maybe exclude them if they already have an existing bottle bill. And then some bills, a fewer, like a subset of them, will be a little more specific on the materials that they're focused on, such as plastics or maybe even single-use plastic items like straws and cups and lids. The other element that's important is the definition of producer. So this specifies who is actually being held responsible, who has to pay into the, who has to join the producer responsibility organization or follow the regulations. And what we're seeing in most bills is a tiered list that starts with the brand owner. But if the brand owner does not apply within that state or that region, then the individual that licenses or trademarks those products or that brand will be responsible. And then after that, whoever imports and distributes it will be responsible. So these systems are structured so that there are no free riders within the system that aren't being held responsible, even though they're putting products onto the market. The other important element that we see in legislation is reference of targets. So some targets will be specified in the legislation. Most legislation indicates minimum targets. And when I say targets, I'm talking about recycling rate targets, potentially recycled content targets. And sometimes there are overall targets, like say all material types need to meet a certain recycling rate. Others will break it down, such as plastic needs to meet this rate, metal needs to meet this rate. And they're typically, the minimums are set in targets, and then the producers are directed to either expand on that or develop that within the plan. A big part of the differentiation too is in cost coverage. So I mentioned that before. Costs typically cover the operations, And they also typically cover administration, so administration of the PRO, as well as the government or municipality individuals and all of that related administration that relates to the program. However, some also extend to the education piece. Some include required investments in infrastructure and market development, and even others go further to include litter prevention and litter abatement even. An important factor, especially as it relates to sustainable packaging, is eco-modulation. So eco-modulation is incentivizing product design and material choices that favor a reduced environmental impact. So basically, there are the way the fees will be structured is to potentially give a discount or change the amount charged depending on specific attributes of that packaging, whether it includes a certain percentage of recycled content or it has lower comparative life cycle emissions, whether it's reusable, made from renewable sources. There's a lot of potentials, and most of those are will be determined more so in the development of the producer responsibility plan. And then one of the things that is, I think, one of the biggest distinctions between a lot of the plans is the responsibility structure and type. And bills really vary in the degree to which producers assume financial and operational responsibility. And I'm going to touch on that more in the next slide because it's a really interesting component. So we used to hear full producer responsibility versus partial producer responsibility, but and what that indicated was really where the funding was split. And so full was typically the producers would pay for everything. Partial would be the producers and the government or municipalities would split it like 50-50 or 80-20. Like there was, I think in certain provinces in Canada, there were splits like that in terms of funding. However, what we're seeing in the US is full financial responsibility for the producers. So producers will pay for 100% of the cost. However, the differentiation occurs at the operational level. So looking at where the operational responsibility is, and it falls on a scale, and this is simplifying it to a bit, but I do want to kind of make a distinction between some of these. So on the one hand, you have municipal reimbursement, which is where municipalities retain control of their operations and reimburse. Potentially no impact to day-to-day operations, but yeah, that's yet to be seen, I think. But in that case, the producers would just reimburse the municipalities for their operations involving covered materials. The next step from there is financial and partial operational, where again, the producers are paying for it all, but municipalities can either choose to retain control of their operations, or if they opt not to, the PRO is responsible for then providing service where those municipalities either opted not to or where service was not provided before. And then similar, it's kind of both in the middle, but financial with municipal contracts, where instead of reimbursing the municipalities, the PROs are then contracting with municipalities to provide the service. So it's a little bit different in terms of the structure and the decision-making that goes behind providing that service. And then on the far end is that full financial and full operational, where producers are responsible for all costs, but they're also responsible for the operations and setting up or contracting with all service providers. So it's a really kind of complex issue. At the SBC, we really want to provide educational resources so that really all stakeholders can know more and understand more. And so a lot of what I've talked about is covered in our guide to EPR proposals. And we're actually in the process of developing a tool where you can break down the current policy, the current bills and policy positions in terms of the elements and really see where the differentiation is. So you can take a look at the bills, you can compare them, and then you can start to understand what the differences are in the legislation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam to kind of talk a little bit, maybe bigger picture in terms of what EPR means.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so I am very fortunate to work with Karen and for her to have accepted my invitation to join me on this today, because Karen is our subject matter expert on EPR, and she's done all the research to understand all of the nuanced facets of these rapidly evolving policy platforms and proposals across the states and the NGO landscape. I have the lucky job today of simply doing some philosophical musing with you about the big picture when we zoom out and think about what EPR is and what it might do and how we should consider it. So I want to share 4 loosely connected musings with you. Much of this is not really my own, anything I would call my own thought leadership. These are things I've heard from others that I've found really thought-provoking, and I believe they deserve amplification. So my first musing is, do we really understand and acknowledge what the goals of EPR frameworks are? And this is an observation I've had. When I talk to folks from any given stakeholder group about EPR, the conversation is almost all about the what and the how, and the why part seems to be a foregone conclusion that everybody has. And I don't think any 2 people are thinking the same thing. So opinions out there range from this default assumption that EPR is intended to raise recycling rates, to a default assumption that it's to get the producer to pay up, and kind of starting and stopping there, just trying to bleed money out of industry, and a lot of opinions in between. And I also think when we look at the mosaic of EPR proposals out there that Karen covered, they have very different goals as well. And I don't think those get talked about enough. So could it be to raise recycling rates? Could it simply be to redistribute the financial burden of covering the cost of recycling? There are other dimensions that I didn't even include on the bullets in these slides. Some EPR frameworks include provisions that make industry responsible for covering the costs of litter prevention and cleanup, or composting programs, or waterway cleanup. There's really just a galaxy out there of intended outcomes for EPR programs. So I want to encourage everybody to question that with yourself and your own understanding, and also when you're having conversations with others about EPR, start with the goals, because I think the outcomes can be varied. And when I listen to decision makers at state agencies, the 2 things I hear the most are that they felt rocked by the Chinese import restrictions in 2018 and got caught flat-footed, all of a sudden having a revenue stream turn to a pretty massive cost burden, obviously put on taxpayers. And I think that leads to the second thing I hear most often, is that governments don't really feel like they should be in the business of linking themselves to the volatile commodity market that is the business of recycling. And there's a feeling of unfairness that industry is dependent on that for their sustainability success, yet they've externalized the cost. So a big chorus that I've heard is EPR is first and foremost to get industry's skin in the game, to have them with a stake in success and a seat at the table. And that's really different than some of these other outcomes that I think are often presumed. So next slide, please. My second musing. Thank you. Regardless of that specific outcome, and usually it's a set of outcomes, it's not one singular monolithic target, it's a collection of things. All EPR programs involve producers paying fees. And I think the overwhelming trend is to use that concept of eco-modulation that Karen introduced to vary the fees depending on certain sustainability characteristics of the packaging. And I find this both really interesting and exceptionally important. So a producer can pay more or less depending on things like how heavy their packaging is, what material their packaging is, how much recycled content is in their packaging, how easily recyclable their packaging is. You can get dinged and pay more if your package design is considered a disruptor to the recycling system. There are all kinds of different dimensions that eco-modulation can take. If we look at the Oregon bill, Karen alluded to this, there's provisions in there that link life cycle thinking and carbon footprints to EPR fees. So I feel that it's pretty safe to assume that the first EPR platforms that successfully get passed, most likely at the state level, are going to have eco-modulation, and that trend will carry on through whatever the future of EPR for packaging in the United States is. And I think that it's an understated outcome there that this eco-modulation essentially ties a producer's bottom line to the sustainability of their packaging. It can all depend on the nuance and the detail of the framework. But if you see these criteria that I've put up here, I hope you can piece that together and see pretty clearly that we are giving a financial incentive and penalty, whichever way you want to look at it, that is much more than simply covering the costs of recycling. And I don't think EPR is often talked about as doing this, but if I look at the likely outcome, I think that's what's going to happen. And I think that is super powerful. So my next musing, please. So I'm saying if we're using EPR intentionally or unintentionally to tie the bottom line of a producer to the sustainability of their packaging, what's that really going to mean for the producer? And I don't want to say this with any disrespect, but I think that there are some delusions out there that EPR gets passed and corporate America runs over to their Titanic piggy banks and sledgehammers it open and forks over a boatload of their profits over to a government sanctioned program. And they say, drat, the government got us again. I guess we're not going to make the profits we thought we were going to make this quarter. That's not how corporate America works. The EPR fees on packaging will be built into the sales price on the shelf at the store. Consumers will pay the EPR fees, and corporations will be stewards of those fees, and they will be the conduit to send them on to help strengthen our recycling system. I don't say that as a cynic. I think that this is not necessarily a bad outcome. Industry still has their part to play. Producers have their responsibility. They are accountable for the whole success of this program. Consumers are generally the ones who pay producers for the stuff they buy. So I think EPR in effect could be called pay as you buy. It's the simple idea that with every packaged product a consumer purchases, there is a fraction of the price that pays for the recycling of that item. The more you buy, the more you pay. The more waste you create, the more recycling for that waste you've bought. So it's effectively desocializing the system of recycling. It could be very complementary to pay as you throw, even though it is a total opposite of that entire framework. So I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think that it's not often clear to folks who really think that EPR is sticking it to the man and it's going to cut into the profit margins of all these big companies. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. So my last musing, if we can go to the next slide, please, is a bit of a change in topic. What is the overarching trajectory here? Because I think it's starting to come into focus. And this is a little bit of prognostication and looking in the Adam Gindel crystal ball. But this is how I see it. There has been a lot of opposition to EPR, largely from the producer community forever, since before I've worked in this field. And that has changed cynically as it's become more and more apparent that EPR is inevitable. It's coming. So industry opposition has shifted. We see a lot of positive advocacy in a lot of different forms, not all the same, but there's still this general sense of opposition to EPR for packaging at the federal level. And I think I wasn't alone back when the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act was first introduced to think, oh, wow, that's probably not going to pass, right? I mean, at the worst, it's shameless grandstanding, and at the best, it's delusion. This bill does not stand a snowball's chance in hell. And what we have seen is a lot of meaningful momentum at the state level. And I think when Karen and I and others share our feeling that EPR is inevitable, the inevitability is at the state level. So it's become sort of a common narrative these days that in 2021, we will see 2 states successfully enact an EPR program for packaging. Whether that's true or not, time will tell. But let's say that over the course of the next 5 years, we have half a dozen states enact EPR programs for packaging. What's that going to look like? These programs are all pretty different from each other. And if we've learned anything about the experience in Canada, there is a lot of griping and grumbling about the lack of harmonization between the provincial programs. I forecast that same griping and grumbling will absolutely rear its head in the US when we have what will be accused of being an unharmonized patchwork of state programs. So on the one hand, that could be a call to the states to work together and to get some common themes threaded throughout each of the individual state approaches. On the other hand, I think it is fuel to the fire to grow support for a national EPR program for packaging. So again, coming back to the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, what once seemed pretty far-fetched, I think actually has a fairly clear path to success. Maybe not in this legislative cycle, maybe not in the next one. Maybe the final platform that does go through will look very different. But it's a bit funny in a way that seems to be the path being traveled. Oppose what happens nationally, be okay with what happens at the state level, and then the states don't agree with each other on all the nuances of the policy, and that makes the national framework look a lot more attractive. So time will tell, but that's my crystal ball on that. So I want to conclude there and turn it over to SWEEP's fearless leader, Rob, to close us out. But before I do so, I want to acknowledge that although my day job is with the SPC, I'm a very proud founding member of the SWEEP steering committee, and I've been with Rob and the SWEEP team since the program's inception in 2016. And I do think that there's lots of important linkages between EPR and SWEEP. Now, again, EPR is predominantly a conversation with action at the state and federal level. SWEEP is targeted at the local community level. And I think that difference is actually the importance, because an EPR program, be it state or federal, can only be as successful as the local recycling systems and infrastructure are. So SWEEP can play a really important role in building up the individual components of our nation's recycling system to get the efficiency and effectiveness that's desired from EPR. So with that last word from me, I will happily turn it over to Rob.
Thanks so much, Adam, for your very thought-provoking musings. There will definitely be a lot of grist for the mill. Next slide. I will just give a quick overview of SWEEP for those of you who are new to the system. SWEEP is a suite of triple bottom line sustainable materials management standards looking to certify local governments and materials management companies. The goal is to identify and reward leaders in the sustainable materials management field, not unlike LEED did for green buildings. We're hoping to provide a standardized framework for the basis for incentive programs. It's a point-based systems similar to LEED, although one of the standards, next slide, is SWEEP 0, and that will be you're either 0 or you're not. We have launched the SWEEP Plus standard, which, as you can tell from the graphic, is designated to address the top approximate quartile of the market. And later on, we will be coming out with the SWEEP standard, which will be a mid-market standard, so that the entire system covers about 3/4 of the market. Next slide, please. So, as we've heard, the excellent presentation about all the elements and nuances of EPR. I'm going to start with a couple of musings first, and then go into how SWEEP addresses EPR. We've, since the Crying Indian, which is frankly one of the things that got me into environmentalism in the 60s, and my first job was helping people at the drop-off recycling center in Tiburon, California. The whole emphasis of the recycling structure has been on consumer responsibility, and consumers have two elements of responsibility in this. First is to figure out what is, quote, good garbage, i.e. recyclables, and what is bad garbage, quote, non-recyclables. And unfortunately, they suck at it. And, it's not necessarily their fault. In part, there's a wide variety of programs. What is, quote, recyclable where you work may not be recyclable where you live or where you travel. And so we're getting a lot of mixed messages. Identification elements on packaging, i.e. plastic type, may be helpful for manufacturers, but it leads to a lot of consumer confusion. And so I think one of the things that we need to change is our mental model and eliminate the idea that there is, quote, good garbage and bad garbage. I think we need to look at everything that we discard as essentially atoms that can be repurposed to a new purpose as they're recovered and reprocessed. And that this allows all of a sudden all materials to have value But the key question between materials that have value and materials that don't have value doesn't have to do with the nature of the materials, or even the environmental impact of materials. It has to do whether they're mixed or separated. And so the key question here is who or what does the separation? Next slide, please. So right now, consumers are in charge of separation, but as we've seen from Europe and other places, that physics, density, dimension, and optical property is a better way of separating materials. And machines are much better at capturing the density, dimension, and optical properties of materials, and therefore using machines to separate materials rather than having people separate materials is a much better way to do it. Now, we could have consumers start that, but the problem is sort of a logistics one, right? If a consumer separates a material to, quote, keep it clean, then you need to maintain that cleanliness by picking it up from the curbside and getting it to its final destination. And that means more trucks. And, transportation, energy, and pollution, stuff like that is certainly not trivial, but compared to the embodied energy of the materials, relatively small. So from an overall environmental perspective, unless you happen to live near a depot or a transfer station or something like that, which again has very significant environmental justice ramifications, the meta impact of the transportation logistics infrastructure is not a huge piece of the overall importance. But what does kill that model is the economics, because collection is by far and away the largest cost element of the waste management infrastructure. About 60 to 70% of all money spent on waste management goes to the logistics of moving waste from its point of generation to its ultimate destination. And so consumer separating materials, having a different truck or truck set up to keep it segregated and move it to its final destination is just a non-starter economically. So that implies that if separation needs to be done, let's consolidate the model to a mixed waste sorting model where everything goes into one bin. It's transmitted to a centralized facility that takes materials from a local waste shed and then separates them using physics with new optical sorting technologies, with robotics, with artificial intelligence. The ability to pick out and differentiate materials has never been greater. And then we've got the ability to take those materials and on the same campus even convert them into products rather than taking relatively low value commodities and shipping them to wherever. And the commodity market model is a 20th century model. We need to move towards a long-term offtake model where we have negotiated supply and consumption agreements between these eco-industrial campuses, whether they're mechanical, biological treatment like they have in Europe, or other forms where there's even further separation and fiber goes to fiber, plastics goes to plastics, et cetera, on an eco-industrial campus. So that will require some commitment on the producer side. That means committing to funding the transition to new infrastructure that could be put into a recycling as infrastructure fund. I believe the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is leading an effort to have recycling and waste management characterized as infrastructure. That's an important initiative that we should all get behind. And we also need to support elements like things that allow tracking and chain of custody identification, like the Holy Grail program, so that when materials come through these advanced AI robotic facilities, that we can begin, ensuring that products are balancing on the ledger. And so, the other thing that we'll need to do is to commit to longer term offtake agreements with the supplier of sustainable contents rather than going into the chaotic spot market. Next slide, please. So for sweep, the challenge of EPR is also structural, right? So if we look at sort of the orb of this, sustainable materials management cycle, the left-hand side is rather easily addressed by sweep because those are the places that are touched by the materials management, sort of the post-life cycle materials management industry. But all the stuff on the right-hand side, which is what our friends from the Sustainable Packaging Coalition and others focus on, is largely dark to us. And so, we can encourage EPR and environmentally preferable procurement of the local governments and of the waste management companies. But again, if we get a quarter of the entire market through that, again, it's a rather weak lever. So this is something, where standards like sweep and other policy impetuses, at the state and federal level will need to coordinate so that we can get, the full life cycle of materials covered by programs that are either voluntary leadership standards like sweep or mandatory requirements for recycled content or other kinds of things that can drive recycled content and products in the market. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. So sweep has 3 or 4 credits that address EPR either directly or indirectly. One of those elements is the Waste Generation and Prevention, or WGP category credit that looks at source reduction programs. An acceptable waste source reduction program would be EPR and other types of product stewardship programs that, fund infrastructure for the collection and management of materials. So that's one credit worth up to 3 points that is addressed by sweep. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Materials Management Policy credit or section, or SMMP, the economic performance key performance indicator has a number of points available, 3 points available for developing market-based mechanisms to reduce waste generation and incentivize more efficient waste management systems. Pay as you throw or save as you throw would be another example. So, I think Adam spoke very, very eloquently about the importance of tying in the consumption-based elements with, the impact, because consumption and impact are related. And so if you are consuming more, then, maybe you should shoulder a little bit more of the responsibility for supporting infrastructure to handle materials sustainably. Next slide, please. And then finally, the source reduction policy is another, sort of the policy foundation. SWEEP has 5 categories. There's the Sustainable Materials Management Policy, which is SMMP. That's sort of the foundation. And that allows people to get credit basically for having policies. The second category is Waste Generation Prevention. That's about tracking, analysis, public involvement, education, and really understanding what's actually happening in your waste management system. And so those are sort of the theoretical, the policy, the research and development aspects of SWEEP. And then we get into the more sort of supply chain and materiality of the waste management system, where we look at collection. So solid waste collection looks at the sustainability of the waste collection system. It looks at route optimization, looks at low emission vehicles. It looks at fuel economy, other types of safety, and training for people in the collection area. And then we move to post-collection recovery. Again, the whole recycling, composting, and the infrastructure and performance of those systems are given various levels of credit. And then finally, there is the post-collection disposal category. But I want to emphasize that disposal is not given any credit in SWEEP. What is credited in SWEEP is the environmentally preferable management of the disposal infrastructure. So it looks at how are you managing your landfill gas? How are you managing stormwater? Are you a good neighbor? Are you reducing idling outside of your landfill? Are you using non-toxic coverings for your alternative daily cover? That type of stuff. So going back to the source reduction policy, we want to reduce waste generation and disposal through programs that encourage waste prevention and reuse. As mentioned before, EPR is considered a waste reduction and source reduction opportunity. And then, in addition to sort of the piecemeal credits, we also have under SMMP a performance pathway. Which basically is sort of the overall goal is to reduce the per capita waste generation of people within the waste shed. And so the various and sundry policies that we have mentioned also can contribute to that particular credit. Next slide, please. So that's, we're still trying to figure out, as EPR evolves, how, and given its focus at the state and federal level, how can we encourage it? If you've got ideas, please join SWEEP. Membership is not very expensive. It's based on whether you are a local government and the size of your local government. But generally, the maximum fee for a large local government is $1,000 a year. And we look forward to your valuable contributions. If you are a private company, again, depending upon your revenues, for small companies, it's a very modest $250 fee. But larger companies would pay up to $5,000 to become members. But as Adam mentioned, we believe that SWEEP is going to have a very profound impact on the market, both for identifying and rewarding leadership, as well as establishing a framework for the definition of sustainable materials management and beginning to regularize the definitions of materials, of how waste characterization studies are done, a lot of things that will really help coordinate and we believe grow the sustainable materials management industry in the United States. Next slide, please. So you can connect with us. We are on all of the major social media platforms. If you go to any of these things and type in SWEEP Standard, you should be able to find us. Next slide. So our next webinar will be in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be looking at municipal composting success stories, looking at the case study of Austin, and we'll also describe how composting and the reduction and treatment of organics in the municipal waste stream is incentivized and rewarded by SWEEP. Next slide. So again, thanks to Karen and Adam for a very provocative presentation. I see that there have been a lot of questions and comments, so hopefully we can get those answered to your satisfaction. And let's go and get some of these questions answered.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Karen and Adam again. It's very interesting stuff and certainly a topic that needs a bunch of unpacking with all its complexities and nuances and deserves to be unpacked. We do have a few questions. I think this one could be directed towards Karen. Please address the question of EPR without producer responsibility organizations, for example, municipal reimbursement EPR.
Yeah, so I touched on that a little bit when I was showing the slide with kind of the scale of operational responsibility. And to my knowledge, any of the US bills don't exclude, they all have a PRO, but it really is the degree to which a PRO is responsible for the day-to-day operations. So on a municipal reimbursement side, there is the PRO that's still collecting the fees, that is consolidating and distributing it, also doing reports and working to meet the targets of the legislation. However, the municipality is the one that is making the decisions about where the service is provided, what facilities they use and all of that. So that's the municipal reimbursement end. And that is more control, if you will, to the municipality in terms of their decisions, the day-to-day operations, versus the other end where producers are the ones managing those contracts.
Great, thank you. Next question is, if companies are conduits, as Adam alleges, might EPR be a regressive tax on low-income Americans who spend a higher portion of their income on consumer products? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I really like this question. So thank you to whoever it was that asked it. It's an important question because I do think as the understanding of EPR evolves, that ought to be a topic that gets the discussion it deserves. It probably needs to be studied, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong when I say I don't believe that has been studied in detail, at least not yet. Keep in mind that EPR fees on a single item of packaging are typically as low as a fraction of a penny. So if I go out and buy a 6-pack of beer, I might have 1 or 2 cents tacked on as the EPR fee. Not to say that that can't add up, right? But the whole concept of EPR is that those per item fees replace the rates you're paying either through your taxes or through your garbage bill or whatever, that go straight to the municipality for them to cover the cost of recycling. So I think it's really important if and when an EPR program gets enacted, that it's made clear that it is supposed to replace that taxpayer burden, which is to say taxes kind of ought to be lowered that increment to compensate for the additional financial burden on consumers. At the end of the day, I think that fees that consumers pay to companies, to pay to their PROs, to pay to the recycling community through EPR really ought to be less than what is currently paid in today's system, our socialized system of financing recycling. So it's an important question that deserves attention, and I don't think it's a tremendous deal breaker. Karen,
just to amplify on that, as I mentioned, collection is the largest portion of the waste management cost structure. It costs, 75 to 100% more to collect a ton of recycling than it does to collect a ton of waste. And so, if as we start consolidating routes, there can be huge cost savings in the overall infrastructure. And as we get more and more materials that are recovered and generate the economic value of those recovered materials, as Adam sort of alluded to, the overall cost of waste management under a fully sustainable system should be significantly lower, and that and funding the system through modest charges on products would end up being a net benefit to all consumers. So if there are short-term transition burdens, there are probably, because you have these issues with gas taxes, with carbon taxes, with any sort of these consumption-related taxes. But we can't ignore the physics of consumption, right? At some point, we're going to have to recognize that all of the burdens on the environment are based on consumption, regardless of who's doing it. And so there would be tax and other kinds of sort of redistributional options available to not penalize folks that are low income. So I think, as Adam said, it's a manageable problem, but it's one that cannot be ignored and one that needs further study.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think we have time for one more, and this is for anyone of the panelists. Should EPR be considered a polluter pays or a polluter controls policy?
Maybe both. I'm not sure I fully understand the context of that question, but theoretically, the more packaging that gets put out into the market and the less favorable the sustainability attributes of that packaging are, the more the producer pays. So if you want to consider that as producer or polluter pays, then sure, I don't think it can be argued against. If you want to think about it as polluter controls, I think there's an element of that too. Keep in mind, though, that an EPR framework puts accountability to the producer community for hitting a certain set of targets, whatever those targets may be and however they may be framed. So control within confines is how I would look at it.
I mean, clearly obviously producers need to have some sort of control over the quality and quantity of materials that they purchase, et cetera. But as Adam pointed out, it's really going to be, they are going to have to pay more, and we're going to have to completely rethink our whole educational program, right? We've got the 3 R's, but 80% of our bandwidth is on that third R, right? The recycling. And under a mixed waste regime, 80% would be on the first 2 R's, right? The reduce and reuse portion of it. And that will help consumers make better choices in terms of the types of things they buy, looking for packaging, how to understand whether packaging is excessive or not. And those signals will be not lost on the market. There will be very quick responses in addition to sort of normal desire to keep, costs competitive, et cetera.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I think that's it for today. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and obviously a very important topic. And keep an eye out on your emails for the next SWEEP webinar, which is on June 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on markers of composting.